Welcome, everyone. This is Ailia Zehra. And in this session, we'll be discussing the upcoming presidential election in the United States and some issues surrounding it. Joining me today is Steve Adler, who is a longtime journalist. He's the former editor-in-chief of Reuters and currently teaches journalism and journalistic ethics at New York University. Steve, thanks very much for joining us today. So I have quite a few issues. There's quite a few issues that I want to address, but why don't we start by talking about your famous memo? So in 2017, when Steve was heading Reuters, he wrote a memo to his staff about the do's and don'ts of covering a Trump presidency. And it was written 10 days after the administration assumed office, right? So we're showing it on the screen. Could you talk a little bit about that time? Because a lot of observers think that Trump may become the president again. So it's worth looking back and assessing some of his policies, especially related to journalists.
Right.
So if you could talk a bit about that time, why did you think that memo was needed, and how was covering a Trump presidency as a newsroom different from covering other presidents?
Right. Thanks. It was a very troubling time for journalists, and news organizations were trying to think through how to manage it. Trump had just been saying that journalists were enemies of the people, that they were terrible people, and there was just a lot of disagreements and confusion about if Trump was at war with us, did we need to be at war with Trump? What did that mean? We weren't used to working with the US president who seemed so anti-press. And of course, Reuters has a very long history, started, I believe, in 1851. And the history is of trying to cover the world through as what we used to be able to call objective, but through as dispassionate and honest and open journalism as we possibly could. And my view was that our experience covering all sorts of governments and regimes around the world and trying to cover them honestly and fairly gave us an extra added advantage over people who were coming to this idea for the first time. So I basically said, we're going to cover Trump the way we cover anybody else. We're going to fact check, we're going to correct errors, but we're also not taking sides. We don't consider ourselves players exactly. We consider ourselves honest brokers, helping our audiences understand what's happening and helping them make their own decisions about what they think about it. That sounds pretty obvious, but it was not what everybody was saying at the time. And I think it panned out well for us. We just said, don't take the bait, don't get into arguments, don't make it about us. It's about the public, it's about our audiences. Don't get so defensive. Try to report it honestly, even if we individually don't like what we're hearing.
Right. The reason why I begin with that is because a lot of journalists who are covering the former president's re-election campaign are finding it difficult to report some of his statements. A lot of stuff that he says is very dangerous. So I know that you've been discussing this a lot over the past few months in a class that you were teaching. So do you think something similar, a set of guidelines from editors is needed now as reporters cover the former president's re-election campaign?
Well, given how the press works in the US, every news organization is going to look at it its own way. And a lot of people I respect a great deal have moved over to the notion that Trump is potentially a threat to democracy. He has denied the legitimacy of an election that, people who have looked at it seriously understand to have been a fair election. He's continued to deny it. He says the election is stolen. And he's also talked about a lot of retaliatory measures he's going to take against his enemies, and his enemies include the press. So again, there are journalists I respect who say that it's no longer kind of a fair fight. It's no longer our job just to report what people are saying, but it's rather our job to take sides and to make it clear that if he's elected, that's really dangerous for the future of the country. And I think I'm sort of someplace in between. I think that when any candidate says something that's blatantly untrue, we can't let that go by. We have to fact check it. We have to challenge it. We have to be on the side of the truth. We have to be on the side of facts, not on the side of one candidate or another, but on the side of facts. So if factually covering Trump means reporting on a lot of things that look as if they're going to be damaging to democracy, it's our job to do that. It's not our job to give him an open forum, and ordinarily probably not to cover statements live that are very likely to be untrue, but rather to have a little more control over the process so that we can describe what's accurate and what's inaccurate. Press is having a lot of trouble doing that on the steps of the courthouse, because Trump's coming out every day during his hush money trial and is saying something to the public. And it's very difficult for the press and for those cameras not to turn them on the president. I still think that we should be taking control over the situation and saying, this is what he said today, this is what's accurate, this is what's inaccurate, and not give him an entirely free ride. On the other hand, we're not Democrats, we're not Republicans. We're trying to help people make up their minds, and a large proportion of the country favors Trump, and we want to be able to reach them and say, okay, this is our understanding of what the facts are.
Right. We'll come to that in a moment, Trump's cases and everything. But if we talk about the overall impression about this election, one thing that we've been hearing a lot is that it's a very crucial one. It's the most crucial election in American history, and that, as you mentioned, democracy is under threat. So could you explain for a non-American audience just how unprecedented the situation is? Is this election really the most crucial one in American history? What exactly is it that makes this election and the situation so unprecedented?
Well, of course, you never know for sure what's the most important election in history until it happens. And we've often said something was the most important election in history. But this is nearly unprecedented in the denial of the legitimacy of his loss against all of the evidence. There have been, I don't have the exact number in my head, but more than 60 court cases that have rejected Trump's claims that something irregular happened during the election that invalidated the votes. We know he tried to put through electors from states who were not actually elected by the people of the states. We know he has denied the election, and he's urged people to fight the legitimacy of the election. That is, if not unprecedented, almost unprecedented. We have a great tradition that we feel strongly about, which is the beautiful moment when somebody loses an election, drives in the car to the Capitol with the president-elect, sits there on the stage and passes the baton to say that we're not a country of men, but a country of laws, and that people accept defeat. And even when the defeat isn't entirely clear, as Al Gore did in 2000, people have gone out of their way to say, for the good of the country, we're going to accept defeat and support the newly elected president. So that's the biggest thing that I think makes this unprecedented. He's saying many things. He said he wanted to be a dictator, at least for the first day. He's questioning whether he wants to abide by the constitutional limit of 2 terms for a president. He's talking about using the federal justice system to retaliate against his enemies. It's not just policy, it's trying to circumvent some of the really cherished separations of power that we have in this country. So if he went ahead and did the things he is saying he would do, that might very well create a very different country and a very different kind of government than we have had. Yeah.
So do you think that when it comes to all the cases that he's facing, he's been using the victim card, he says that he's a victim of the system. Do you think that all these cases that he's facing, his visits to the courts, that it's all helping him play the victim and just appear as a populist leader and kind of like woo his supporters?
Well, he has tremendous hold over his supporters. I certainly in my lifetime haven't seen anything like it. And also they're consuming a different set of news sources than other people in the country are. So they're not even seeing the trial the same way. If you look at the right-wing media, it's not talking about whether the charges are valid or what the witnesses are saying and how good the case is. Every day they're just saying this is a political prosecution, this is outrageous, this is unfair, this is unethical. This is a breach of democracy, the very fact that there are these court cases. So I think, when he's being prosecuted, he's making the case that he's being in fact persecuted and that he's a victim. And there are people in history who we all admire, Nelson Mandela, who were thrown in prison, who we don't think as therefore they were criminals. We think therefore they were persecuted, they were victims, and he and his followers have been taking that position, and I think very effectively. So it doesn't seem like any of the court cases are hurting him, and they may in fact be helping him.
Right, right. We've also been hearing that there are a lot of times judges are delaying unnecessarily the cases, and there are also some concerns about the judges being, well, he says that the judges are biased against him, but a lot of observers think that all these delays that we're seeing are probably they're favoring him, which means that the judges may be trying to favor him. So do you think that he should be like, we know that the hush money trial is probably the only one where we could see a conviction before the election. Do you think that this delay in decisions on his cases is something that will also potentially affect democracy, because voters will not be able to make informed decisions when they don't know the truth about these allegations?
Yeah, I was surprised that the charges were not brought earlier. I put more of the onus on the prosecutions because they took a very long time to bring the charges. Court cases tend to take time. Any well-funded defendant, we're talking about wealthy defendants, and Donald Trump is not the only wealthy defendant. Wealthy defendants have all sorts of delay tactics, regardless of who the judges are, regardless of the composition of the court system. And I think a lot of the delay tactics the Trump lawyers have used are fairly standard, and you would expect them to do. And courts will often say, okay, I need to consider that. So I'm not that surprised that they're being delayed. I was surprised that the prosecutions weren't brought more quickly. And while if you look at the substance of the charges, there's a tremendous amount to be looked at. I won't say he's guilty, but there's clearly charges that are worth going to court with. But those charges are complex. Some of them are based on new applications of the law. There's a case before the Supreme Court now looking at whether a particular law that makes it illegal to interfere with the functions of Congress and the functions of government, whether that's being applied properly to the January 6 cases. These are some newer applications of the law, and you would expect them to be appealed by the courts. The other thing I would note is, I believe I'm correct that all of the prosecutions have been brought in a Democratic administrations, either at the state level or at the federal level. So those people who say that it's politicized, that they do have on their side the notion there isn't a single Republican, either elected or appointed prosecutor who has brought criminal charges against Trump. So that does feed into the notion, particularly among Trump supporters, that the prosecutions are unfair. Having looked at the indictments, there's a lot in the indictments, and certainly that's worth going to trial with. But I would note they're all Democratic prosecutors.
Right. I also want to address the recent episode where Supreme Court Judge Justice Samuel Alito's family was, there was a New York Times report that said that his family showed a American flag that was hung upside down outside their home. And it's a sign of a distress signal, and it happened during the tense period between the Jan 6 insurrection and Biden's inauguration. So a lot of people are questioning that it was a sign that was being used by MAGA Republicans who were denying the results of the election. So this is particularly interesting to our Pakistani audience because there have been similar instances of supposed bias from judges in Pakistan, where there have been audios where their families have been heard talking about how a certain politician should be favored. Yeah. So how do you see this? I'm just curious to know if you think that this is an indication that the judges are favoring him and the justice system is supporting him.
Right. So the upside down flag is broadly a symbol of distress, but in this recent period, it's been adopted by the people who, the so-called stop the steal people, the people who believe the election was stolen. And it's a very clear symbol of the notion that the election was illegitimate, and being put up right after January 6th. I think it's a fair interpretation that it was a reflection of favoring the people who thought the election was being stolen. So I think it's a legitimate concern. Now, Justice Alito says his wife put it up. It was based on a dispute she was having with a neighbor who had some very aggressively anti-Trump signs on their lawn, and that he was not responsible for doing it. It goes to the broader question. There's nobody to judge the Supreme Court on ethics. They judge themselves on ethics. They've tended to have very lax ethics rules, and even though they made them a little stricter recently, they're the only judges of whether anybody has violated the ethics rules. And there's basically nothing anybody can do about it. So I think the most that people are urging Justice Alito to do is to recuse himself, take himself out of judging cases involving the January 6th incidents, and there's cases pending, because clearly, with that flag in front of his house, at least it creates the appearance that he favors the people who believe the election was stolen. Now, he's very unlikely to do that. He's very unlikely to recuse himself. But I do think it's at least an appearance that he has a conflict of interest. He's not the first justice who's been out there, or family members have been out there supporting kind of far right positions. Justice Clarence Thomas and his wife have been very active on the pro-Trump and the right-wing side. His wife has. I mean, he hasn't specifically favored one thing or another, but there's also the appearance there that he also is conflicted. But again, nobody's going to be able to come in and tell them that they have to do something differently. And I think, they would both defend themselves as, looking at the cases based on their merits and making their decisions. But it is casting somewhat of a taint on the court. And the court's credibility with the public is way down from the way it used to be. And this is probably only going to affect it negatively. But again, I don't honestly see any consequences to it ultimately.
Is there a law that says anything about judges' families taking political positions or their immediate family members getting involved in politics?
There's really no law that limits what Supreme Court justices do. They have ethics rules, which I believe, include, avoiding conflict of interest and avoiding making public statements. But again, that's not enforceable by anybody. It's not a statute. It's not in the Constitution. So it's fairly meaningless. It's more, the public. The only real remedy for a judge doing something that people consider really inappropriate is impeachment. Judges, like presidents, can be impeached. There has occasionally been a federal judge over the years who has been impeached, generally for real wrongdoing, sometimes criminal wrongdoing. But this isn't the kind of thing that would lead to an impeachment. You would have to, be found to have taken bribes or to have done something really extreme. So I think this is unfortunate. It doesn't make the court look good. People on the left will make a big fuss about it, but ultimately, I just think things will continue as usual.
Do you think that the American media has done a good job of explaining to the people how unprecedented and how unusual this situation is, with a leading candidate being involved in all of these things, being on trial, and what it means for the country's democracy?
I think by and large, the press gets blamed for things that perhaps they shouldn't be blamed for. I think there's a lot of bad reporting in this country. There's a lot of jumping to conclusions, speculating, deciding too soon what you think will happen. There's a lot of focus on what we call the horse race: who's winning, who's behind, who's ahead in the polls. That said, I think it's a false accusation of the press that we haven't informed people who Trump is, what he wants to accomplish, what he's saying, who's backing him, how he feels about immigrants, how he feels, about race, how he feels, about free press, how he feels about democratic processes. That's out there. That's perfectly clear. In fact, there's a danger of just constantly repeating it. I think a lot of people in the press somehow think that if only we did a better job of explaining the stakes, people would vote differently. And I just don't believe that's true. I think we have a responsibility to show the stakes, but that doesn't mean people are going to vote the way a lot of people in the press would like them to vote. I think people are going to vote the way they believe their interests are. And I think the press is very condescending when it says people don't understand their interests. They're voting against their interests. But if you're living somewhere and inflation is up something like 15 or 20% over the course of the last 4 years cumulatively, you're seeing prices that much higher than in 2016. While in truth, you can't blame a president ordinarily for economic conditions, people always do in every election. And people are seeing inflation. It's making it harder for them to buy basic goods. They're upset about it. And usually that works against the incumbent, no matter who's running against them.
Right, definitely. So coming to the election, what do you think is the most important issue for the people, for voters? What's going to be the deciding factor in your opinion?
Well, based on what voters are saying, and I think it also comports with what's happening in the country, I think, as usual, the economy is the most important factor. People are mostly not on Twitter or X. They're not demonstrating. They're not going to rallies. Most people are just living their lives every day, paying a bit of attention to what goes on in politics, and worrying about their livelihood, worrying about whether their kids are going to be better off than they are, worrying about the cost of an education and the value of an education, but mostly worrying about the cost of food, and housing. And if that's going up, that's a huge issue. And if you can persuade them unemployment's really low, which it is, that inflation is getting less, which it is, perhaps you can have an impact if you're a Democrat, but I think that's the most salient issue. And I think the second one in people's minds is immigration, because it does feel as if the borders are open, that we have no control over our borders. It's an easy scare topic, that people are just flooding into the country and they're going to do us harm. So there's a little bit of that xenophobia about outsiders, but there's also worry about people taking jobs that non-immigrants, might need. So I think those are by far the two big issues. I think the third big issue is abortion among lots of young people, and among Democrats and independents, among women. The very, very harsh rules on abortion that have been put through by Republican states. The fact that Trump put the people on the Supreme Court who created the decision that took away abortion rights, Roe v. Wade. I think that's a big issue and could get people voting who might not otherwise vote. So that works against some of the things that I think favor Trump. And the other thing I'd say is, you never know what's going to happen in the country or in the world between now and Election Day that changes everything, because it is still a number of months away, and things that happen towards the end. A lot of people don't make up their minds until maybe October, and so you never know what's going to happen in the fall. If there's another big pandemic, if something really bad happens in the world, more than what bad is now happening in the world, you could see something that affects how people think. Also, since you've got a 77-year-old and an 81-year-old, you might end up with somebody getting really sick or injured or in some way incapacitated, that just in terms of kind of demographics or age-related issues, is certainly a possibility.
Right. So a lot of it depends on the news cycle closer to the election. Yeah. So we haven't talked at all about Biden, which is problematic. So I do have one question about him. Do you think that his refusal to call for a ceasefire in Palestine is something that it has definitely affected his popularity among young progressive voters? Do you think that this is something that might cost him the election?
Well, I just saw a poll today that showed that young voters, 18 to 29, were sort of dramatically more pro-Palestinian than they were pro-Israeli, and that as each age group went, it shifted. The oldest voting age group was more pro-Israel, and it kind of went sequentially among age groups. So it's certainly that age group, which has traditionally voted Democratic, I think is somewhat at risk. What makes it complicated is that people can have opinions about a lot of things and care a lot about them. It doesn't always answer how they're going to vote. What is the issue that's most important to them? So for young people, again, I'm looking at polls, they're not necessarily reliable. For young people, It doesn't seem like that's the most important issue, even though they significantly favor the Palestinian cause over Israel. They may end up voting, more on other kinds of issues, again, like job opportunities, the economy. Some people, young people are very concerned about the environment, about global warming. So it's really hard to determine how people are going to end up voting, particularly this early on. But I think he sees that as a challenge, and some of the steps he's taken more recently, he's trying to balance, kind of different constituencies. There's also a question which I don't discount in political leaders, which is also, wanting to do the right thing. I think sometimes we look at politics as merely how you're going to play to one interest group or another. And, every politician has a lot of that in them. But I also think Biden has a value system. And I think that value system has been heavily strained, by these terrible events. And his assumptions have been challenged, and he's now called for a ceasefire. I mean, he's on the other hand, he's continuing to arm Israel. So I think he's having real difficulty with the issue. But it's a very, putting aside the merits of the issue, just looked at politically, it's a very, very hard issue. You've got Republicans taking a very strong pro-Israel stance. You're trying to get independents who may be on one side or the other. So from a political standpoint, I'm not sure what position helps you or hurts you. And then you may just decide, I need to do this because this is the right thing to do.
Definitely. Do you think this could have been handled better?
I'm sure. I mean, anything can be handled better in retrospect. I think it's one of the very hardest jobs in the world. You have alliances. You're thinking geopolitically as well as, honestly, as well as human cost and human toll. You're looking at where, is the U.S. going to need to be in order to kind of protect itself around the world? So there's a lot of strategic thinking. There's a lot of really bad things going on in the world, in other places in the world that aren't getting the kind of attention Israel-Palestine are getting. And that has something to do with how emotional an issue it is in America and many other places, partly to do with the fact that it's very politically freighted. The U.S. wants strategically to have a good stronghold in the Middle East. They're trying to figure out what their proper relationship should be with Saudi Arabia. There are tremendous harms going on, for example, in Myanmar and Sudan, killings of tens of thousands of people, and tremendous misdeeds going on. It's not getting the kind of global attention for all sorts of reasons, but morally, you would hope that, really bad things happening anywhere in the world would get people's attention. But politically, you're going to end up focusing on the things that both implicate your strategic needs and also the kind of belief systems and feelings of the voters. So it's incredibly complicated.
We're almost running out of time, but I do have one last question. What do you think will a Trump administration look like? Do you think that his policies will be more dangerous this time? And will the polarization that we're witnessing right now in the country deepen if he's reelected?
No, honestly, I don't know. And most people don't say that. And most people won't say, I don't know. But it's very hard to predict the future. So I think for those people, for example, who care about press freedom, and I'm chairman of the board of Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. We provide free legal services to journalists in trouble. So for somebody in that position, I'm very vigilant. We're watching out for free press violations. But I honestly don't know, tell you the truth, what Trump stands for. I don't know if he's got political convictions beyond what he needs to get elected. And I honestly don't know what he'll do when he's in office. I do think his history is of being vindictive and attacking his enemies and never admitting wrongdoing. I mean, even he's written about that in some of his books. On the other hand, I think there's probably not a lot of virtue in exaggerating or coming to a conclusion that it's the end of our form of government and the end of democracy. I'd say it might be, but we do have strong institutions. We do have separation of powers. We do have the ability to vote for a Congress that isn't the same party as the president. We've seen in the Supreme Court that despite some of the ideological reasons they were put on the court are not necessarily ruling predictably on a lot of issues. You've seen a lot of less predictable rulings, less political rulings. You have life tenure on federal courts, and judges have come up through a legal structure that believes in the rule of law. So there's lots of checks and balances. I'm not sure it's going to be easy to overthrow it. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I don't think it's going to be easy. I think the institutions are strong. And I have no idea what he's going to want to do or what his motivations are. And I think people should acknowledge that it's very hard to tell.
What would be your message for young journalists in the US from vulnerable groups who are currently thinking that they may not have a future in Trump's America?
Like, I can't judge for somebody else. I think vulnerability is something that's scary and personal. I've lived here my whole life, and I want to be here, and I want to, fight for democracy and care about what's going on in the country. I'm not that pessimistic. I'm not, certain that things will go badly, but I can tell you honestly that I'm sure they'll go well, which is not a very helpful answer. I think there's uncertainty. We have a lot of trouble with uncertainty. We're living with uncertainty. You can't say for sure it's time to move to another country. And you can't say for sure that everything's going to be okay. We do not know. And that's in some ways the most troubling thing to say, but I think that's the truth.
No, that's very important what you said. I think uncertainty is the word that would kind of summarize what we are seeing right now. And there's a lot of uncertainty, but we hope for the better. And we, as journalists, our job is to make sure that we report accurately and fearlessly. That's what matters. Thanks so much for your time.